We began last week. I don't think we finished the discussion, but we began talking about morality as an argument for God's existence. I got a couple things, 2 or 3 things I want to mention here as we pick up that discussion. One, I'll mention, this is more general. I was listening to a fellow, an atheistic fellow, just this past week, and was talking about why people don't believe in God, those who do not, why they don't. And one of the reasons that he would say, even in his case, he went from being a religious person to not believing in God. And one of the things that he mentioned, and he was kind of mentioned it as being a big thing, was that people don't just accept what the preacher says anymore. And to that, I would say, good. We don't need to just accept what a preacher or anybody else says, for that matter. But he attributes the increase of non-believers, skeptics, agnostics, at least in large part to people having so much more access to the internet. He said they could be sitting in your sermon and they can just Google, or they can just get on the internet and fact check you. Well, there is some truth to that, but I want to be fact checked. That's not a bad thing. B, well, where are we going for the fact checking? And that's the big question, because if something is being fact checked by the Bible, well, that's a good thing. But if it's just the internet, and that's kind of goes with, I guess that would be C or B part 2, I had to kind of chuckle because I just, sometimes you're watching a video or listening to something, and I wish I could be having a conversation, because I would kind of laugh and say, you do realize that not everything on the internet is true, right? Because anybody can put stuff out on the internet. And I go through this sometimes with my own children. They're doing papers, and maybe they've got a research assignment or something like that. And of course, my older children are all homeschooled. So they're working on this paper, and they'll turn it in, and they've done 75% of it from Wikipedia. And I tell them, nope. Well, why not? I mean, it's so easily accessible. Yes, it is. It's also easily editable. Anybody can edit most stuff on Wikipedia. In fact, maybe all things on Wikipedia. I'm not 100% sure. But most teachers don't allow Wikipedia as a source. It might be allowed as a source, but it cannot be like the primary source. I know that in higher educational settings. And so I tell my children, I don't want you to start thinking you can just go to Wikipedia for things. In fact, I've been there, and probably you have as well, and seen things that just simply weren't true. And so, yes, we do live in an information age, as it's often referred to, but that's not inherently a bad thing, either for agnostic, atheistic folks or Christian folk. So how do we use it? And do we understand that not everything on the internet is true? It's just the sad reality. There's a lot of garbage out there. There's a lot of just completely untrue stuff out there on the internet. And so we have to learn to do some digging and to look deeper and to do some thinking and reasoning. Yes, sir, Bob. Acts 17:11. Go ahead and read it.
Now, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, examining the scriptures daily, whether these things were so. Well, these things they heard were from the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, and they still checked it. They still fact-checked it, as we might say. Acts 17:11, talking about those Bereans. They received the word with all readiness of mind, and they searched the scriptures daily, whether those things were so. And so the fact-checking is not a bad thing. That was another thing about that just came to me. I was meant to mention that as well, that this fellow mentioned was that people aren't just going to blindly accept what the preacher says anymore. And so, thus, again, he would say, part of the reason for the increase in atheism. Look, I have said it numerous times. And sometimes people, in logic, it's called a straw man argument. And the idea is you construct this straw man and then you just rip it to shreds. Well, I mean, it's a straw man, right? Not that difficult to do. And that's the reason for that analogy and the reason for the naming of the argument. But what it means is you come up with an argument that is easily defeated, but what it really is, it's not valid. And so what sometimes people will do is, in the realm of unbelief, skepticism, they'll construct this straw man of just blind faith. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some out there in the religious realm that will teach that. You just have to believe, just take it on nothing, take it on faith, blind faith. But that's not the Bible definition of faith. The Bible definition of faith is always based on evidence, and it's based on reason. We talked about that from Isaiah 1:18. So, like I said, I just ran across that this past week, and I wanted to mention that because the whole blind faith thing is a straw man argument. I would not tell anybody just to believe in God based off no evidence, but you just got to have faith. You do got to have faith, but it's got to be biblical faith, and that's based on evidence, looking at evidence and going where the evidence leads us. And again, just from what we looked at so far, I think that just the cause and effect argument, just the design argument, those are strong arguments for God. Those are two votes, we might say, for God's existence. Morality being another one. Another thing that goes with our discussion on morals, somebody mentioned this to me that said it might be good to deal with, and I would definitely want to deal with it because I want to make sure I clarify this. But we were talking about, I think it was right here, I think the summary questions will get it without having to go back any further. If God did not exist, would objective, universally accepted, unchanging moral values exist? Do you believe objective moral values exist as far as being universally accepted, unchanging? The statement that I made, or something to the effect, again, I don't think we need to go back, but it was dealing with morality, whether something is good or bad. And I made the statement that if you don't have God in the equation, you don't have good or bad. There's no standard there. And so what was mentioned to me was that, and this was not mentioned just trying to argue, but just saying, hey, here's what I've heard some people say in answer to that statement. And I think it's very good to point this out. Sometimes in answer to that or in reply to that, people will say, well, but look, there are a lot of atheists. In fact, some atheists will be quick to tell you this. I'm not out living a party hard type of lifestyle. I'm not out hurting anybody, killing anybody, stealing from anybody. I go to my job. I work hard for the entire time that I'm there. And you know what? Some of them will tell you I work harder and more honestly than some of the Christians, so-called, in my workplace. And sometimes, sadly, that is the case. They say, look, I live a good moral life, and I'm an atheist. So there you go. Don't tell me that, if you're an atheist, you can't have morals. Look, and this is one of the reasons why I want to be sure to mention this, because I want to make sure I'm clear. No one is saying, I'm certainly not standing here telling you, nobody's saying that every single atheist is out there living just a horribly worldly, in the gutter type of life. The fact of the matter is there are lots of folks out there that would say I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, I'm a skeptic, that they are hard workers, sometimes, in many cases, honest, But here's my point. And for an atheist even to say, whoa, buddy, I live a good moral life. Well, there you've got an issue. Because good, moral, well, by whose standard? Is that by your standard? Is that by my standard? Somebody else looks at that and says, I don't think that's a very moral life. Or somebody could be living, as we would say, in the gutter type of lifestyle. They may say, well, I think my life's a good moral life. If you don't have a standard, who's to say what is good or what is bad, what is moral or what is immoral? And again, that goes with what we've been talking about with morals and where we left off last week. Right along with that, this quote was submitted, comes from Marcus Aurelius, and again, somebody mentioned to me that they've heard folks use this statement before. Maybe not even folks that are what we would call atheistic, but maybe they just say, look, I'm not really a spiritual person. They may believe in God, but they're not interested in the church or being a spiritually minded person. Sometimes they'll mention this quote from Marcus Aurelius, and of course realize that this is translated from, I guess it'd be Latin, so but it is a translation. Live a good life if there are gods and they are just, then they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. If there are gods but unjust, then you should not want to worship them. If there are no gods, then you will be gone, but will have lived a noble life that will live on in the memories of your loved ones. And just commenting on that, again, the statement itself, and I think, again, I tried to, we put our heads together and tried to get a little bit more context to the quote because, and part of the, for all of our living in the information age, our society loves to boil information down to like Twitter-sized quotes that sometimes get really, really ripped out of context. And you see this sometimes even on news broadcasts and things like that. Sometimes people will take just a snippet of what somebody says and there's a larger context there that's missed. But I think, the best I could tell contextually, he's actually not arguing against any deity's existence. Now, bear in mind, this fellow was a Roman emperor. And so living in the Roman Empire, being a Roman emperor, he would have believed in many gods, paganistic type theology, idolatrous, polytheistic. But just looking at the quote, again, it begs a standard. If there are gods and they are just. And of course, the second part says if there are gods and they are unjust. Says who? And that's the question that begs to be asked and answered. Somebody might say, well, if a God says, or the God of heaven says, this is what I expect of you, and it must be done in order to go to heaven and have eternal life, well, that's not very just. You see, if I'm the standard, I could decide that. But we're not the standard. So again, that, in the statement, if there are gods and they are just, they'll not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. Well, that's just another example of works salvation. As if you could do something to put God, or in this case, gods, in your debt, having owed you salvation. But of course, biblically, God doesn't save us on the basis of works, and that's not to say that there's no work to be done on our part. We must obey what he says to do. But those works don't leave God in our debt. But again, to say just or unjust, you've got to ask, what is the standard? And looking at cause and effect, looking at design in the universe around us, that, we've said this numerous times, they tell us very clearly there is a God. He is alive. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Psalm 19:1. But what is just? What is unjust? What is moral? What is immoral? What is good? What is bad? Those are questions we don't know without some kind of revelation from God. He has to tell us that. Nature itself the design, the great effect demands an adequate cause, but what is he like? Does he care about us? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What do we do to please him? Can we please him? Can we have life when this life is over? Or is this it? All those are questions you can't answer without some kind of specific, special revelation from deity. And that's what we have in the pages of the Bible, and some of that gets into booklet 2. But I did want to mention those two things because, the first part, like I said, I want to make sure I clarify that because sometimes, and I mentioned this in that discussion with the one who asked me the question, if we're not careful, Bible-believing people and Christians in general, we can think of every skeptic or agnostic or atheist as, they are just low-down, dirty, rotten people, and man, you don't want to be around those folks because they'll just, you turn your back for a second, they'll steal from you, they'll kill you, they'll hurt you, whatever. And that's not always the case. There may be some people like that. Hey, newsflash, there are some professed Christians that are like that. But be that as it may, not everybody's like that, even among non-believers. It's not to say that atheists have no morals. It is to say without God, you have no standard for morality. Because one person says something is good, one person says it's bad. Well, who's to decide between that? And again, this came up in our discussion, and I'll mention, I think we touched on it briefly last week. There are people, and it's one of the just absolutely frightening things in our culture, in our country, and sometimes just really makes me tremble for the future, my children, grandchildren if there are any, and so on. But we have people, even in our country, that think if an adult wants to marry a young child, if a grown man wants to marry a boy, he should be able to do that. Somebody says, man, that's sick. That's wrong. Well, that person would say, it's wrong to you. I think it's perfectly fine. And on what basis? If I'm the atheist person who is, I'm not that down in the gutter person, and I would say to that person, you can't do that. A child? Well, who says I can't do that? You? Are you the standard? If I'm an atheist, I got nothing else to draw from there. Anything goes. It is the end result. If you follow that to its logical conclusion. But if there is a standard, and there is, well, then there is a right and there is a wrong. And so where we left off last week, we were talking about the very existence of morality, and you don't need me to tell you that morality exists. The terms ought and ought not, should not, they exist as much in an atheist's vocabulary as in the Christians. And so we know there is morality, and morals arise only in man. We mentioned that, the atheistic George Gaylord Simpson made that statement in a textbook. But so question number one is, what is the origin of morality? That's the question that begs to be answered. Well, if you don't acknowledge the existence of God, how do you explain morality? The need for morality is universally apparent, because without it, anything goes. You got to have some kind of a moral standard. And again, we discussed last week just a little bit the Nuremberg trials and that concept, that phraseology of crimes against humanity. Because there's a higher standard. They didn't violate German law. They didn't violate international law. There was no international law about that. So how do you try those people? Well, crimes against humanity. Number 2 question is, what is the motivation for morality? The very existence of morality makes us ask the question, what is the motivation for it? Well, the atheist says morality just evolved. They say society evolved morality for its own welfare and preservation. But here's the thing, animals have survived. They haven't got any morality. They haven't evolved morality, and yet they're not just dying out in droves. So that's not going to work. And again, what if I decide to do just whatever pleases me and helps me? And somebody says, Chad, that's selfish. I might say, well, what's wrong with selfishness? Again, if you're coming at it from a totally atheistic standpoint, you got no answer to that question. If you got something and I want it, and I can, I'll just take it from you. Well, Chad, don't do that. That's wrong. Says who? What's wrong with it? Well, we shouldn't steal. Why not? You got no answer for that without a standard. A third question, morality's existence demands an answer to, how is morality to be defined? This gets to the just and the unjust part that we mentioned of the Marcus Aurelius quote. And this is the issue that is, as one fellow said, atheism dreads it like the plague. If the unbeliever's contentions are right, then there are no universal rights, no universal wrongs. Man becomes his own law and actually becomes his own God. In that sense, we would all be gods. And ironically, perhaps you've heard of the Humanist Manifesto. There's Humanist Manifesto 1, there's Humanist Manifesto 2. I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's in both 1 and 2. There is this statement. I was going to say I'm for sure it's in 2. I'm for sure it's in one of them, but I'm thinking 2, but I believe it's in both. But the statement is made, ethics, this would be morality, ethics is autonomous and situational. But that is 100% contradictory. Why? If ethics are autonomous, what does that mean? Self-rule. I mean, it's based off of, I think it comes from Greek. I know the nomos is a word for law in Greek. I believe that word comes from the Greek, but it literally means self-rule, self-governing. So if ethics are autonomous, then you determine what's right and wrong for you. I determine what's right and wrong for me. But if ethics is situational, what does that imply? It implies that there is a situation in which something could be unethical or immoral. Is that not what you're implying when you say ethics is situational? Well, there is some situation in which something could be unethical. But yet you just said it's also autonomous. You see, it's contradictory. It just doesn't work. And the fact is, if there is no God, then there's no such thing as evil or good, except in every individual's own eyes. And then the existence of morality, number 4, begs the question, does immorality have an ultimate consequence? And this is where we wrapped up last week. We were kind of rushing through that, but I mentioned Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, Paul the Apostle. Very different lives, right? But as far as after they leave this life, does it make any difference whether you live your life following the example of Paul the Apostle or whether you live your life following the example of Adolf Hitler? Is there any consequence to either one? And again, if the atheist is true to and consistent with his own beliefs, he has to say no. It doesn't matter. You could live like one or the other, and it's all the same. Who could imagine that? Who could picture a world where folks lived that way? And so morality, it does exist, and those are some questions that we have to deal with and think about in that context. Now, we got a couple more. We covered this page, right? That's where we stopped. Oh, okay. So what standard or law would you use to define evil? Well, again, it would have to be, if we're going to be logical, it have to be the law of God. Otherwise, we have no universal standard, no standard that could reach beyond just the individual. Does the existence of good require the existence of evil? Obviously it does. If there's good, then, well, what is the absence of good? Evil. If there's something to do that is good, and if you don't do it, that's not good. If there's something that it's the opposite of that, that would be evil. What standard or law would you use to define goodness? And again, this is where, you may, if you're in a study, you may get different answers, at least at first. Hopefully that would change as you go through the study. But somebody may say, that first question, what standard or law would you use to define evil? They may say, well, if it hurts somebody, if it hurts somebody else, that's evil, that's bad. Well, what if there's something that is not necessarily hurting somebody, but you might think it's not hurting one person, but it's offensive to somebody else, or it hurts somebody else. So you see, that doesn't really work, because there are situations where something could be wrong, but sometimes people will say the standard they would use, does it hurt me? Well, so would it be okay just to go out and, something like what Hitler did? It doesn't affect me, so I'm not really worried about that. Surely we wouldn't take that position. And again, what standard or law would you use to define goodness? Sometimes people say, well, is it helping others or things like that? But again, you got to have a standard that reaches beyond just my think so, your think so, our standard, my standard, your standard. And that's where you need and must have a universal standard. And that is a powerful argument for the existence of God. And again, I think you look at all these arguments, and I believe when you're talking cause and effect, design demands a designer, or morality, that any one of those just on their own is pretty powerful evidence, argument for the existence of God. But you put them together, and it's to me, again, somebody else may say, well, I don't think so, but I just don't know how you could logically deny that. That's at the very least, a very powerful composite argument for the existence of God. You see the verse there, Mark 10:18, Jesus' statement, why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. He is the standard of what is just, what is unjust. He's the one that sets that standard. So just a few more questions here from the animal kingdom that argue for the existence of God through morality. As a tiger that escapes from the zoo slays a helpless child taken to prison and given a trial, obviously, no, that's not going to be the case. Is a human who murders a helpless child taken to prison and given a trial? To ask that question is to answer it, right? Do animals have morality? No, they do not. Again, we notice that quote from Simpson, morals arise only in man. Do humans have morality? Yes, they do. If humans have morality and animals do not, from where does morality arise? Or where does it come from, we might say? Again, how do you answer that? Without a God, the God of heaven, who is and sets that moral standard. We don't prosecute animals when they kill even a human being. They say, well, maybe we're going to put that animal down, but he's not put on trial or something like that. Because we understand it's not morals. They don't have morals. They don't have that understanding. But humans do. Does an animal have a conscience? No. Even in those situations where an animal escapes, a wild animal, and maybe kills a human, they don't sit there and go, oh, you know what, I shouldn't have done that. I feel bad. They don't have a conscience. Does a human have a conscience? Obviously they do. All things being equal, there are certain disorders where somebody may not. But we understand it's a disorder. Humans, when things are working as they should, they have a conscience. Does a lion feel remorse after killing its prey? Obviously it does not. Do most humans feel remorse after killing another human being? Again, unless you're a sociopath, yes, you're going to have some kind of remorse. If a human has a conscience and an animal does not, from where does the conscience come? Again, I don't know how you answer that without a divine creator. If a conscience were the result of purely random chemical processes, could we trust it? If a conscience were designed and created by a moral lawgiver, could we trust it? The only caveat I would give here is understanding the degree to which we trust conscience, because a conscience can be trained. You can have a situation where somebody may do something and feel no compunction of conscience about it, because that's how they were raised. I've talked to Christians who maybe said, I grew up in a home where people drank alcohol. I mean, just all the time. No big deal. And so when I grew up and I was of age, I began drinking. Didn't think anything of it. And then I became a Christian and started studying. The more I studied, the more I realized that I couldn't justify that with Scripture. And so even though it was something they didn't feel guilty about from the conscience standpoint, it was something that was not right. But understanding just to have that ability to feel guilt, to feel that regret, that's uniquely human. And that is, again, an argument for a moral lawgiver, a creator, giver of morality. Romans 1:20, you see that. We've looked at this verse before. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. All right, we're going to move into another section here. And I'm going to go ahead and cover this, and if I run out of time, I'll cover my additional material to go with that next week. But let's go ahead and get through this little section on pain and suffering. Pain and suffering, a blessing from God. You know, how often do we think of that? But they can be. One of the arguments that a lot of skeptics, atheists, agnostics will have against the existence of God. The person I talked to more recently says he's an atheist. One of the questions came up, well, okay, so what led you, why are you an atheist? I don't even know that we asked that, did we, Bob? I think he just came out and told us, just said, look at all the children in the world, starving, suffering. I can't believe in God. If there was a God, he'd do something about that. Well, what about that? I told you, I think those three arguments that we looked at, cause and effect, design demands a designer, and morality, are pretty powerful arguments alone or especially collectively for the existence of God. I think morality maybe, if I had to just pick one of those, say I thought was the most powerful, morality might be it. But from the atheist standpoint, this is probably, I don't know, what do you think, Bob? I think it's probably one of their stronger arguments.
It's a very emotional.
And I think that's probably why it's one of the strongest, because it is very emotional. Nobody likes to see, and again, that's, why do we have that, knot in the gut type feeling when we see somebody else suffer? It may not even be somebody that we know. I mean, sometimes we just see suffering on the news, and it gets to us. Animals don't feel that. That in itself, that it bothers us, tells us something is unique about humankind. But yeah, it's especially when it's somebody close to us. We don't like to see our loved ones suffer. We don't like to suffer ourselves, do we? So what about that? Pain and suffering. So does pain serve as a warning device when you place your hand on a hot stove? Obviously it does. And, aren't you glad in those situations that you have the sensation to feel pain? Because otherwise you could put your hand on a hot stove and just burn right through, and, you wouldn't know. And I've read actually of situations where people, I think one person I read of one time, I think they were born that way, or they couldn't feel pain. Something was wrong, and they absolutely could not feel pain. And oh man, it was just this. I think it was an article or something, and it just went on and on with all the things that this child dealt with because he couldn't feel pain. It really was a pitiable state. Well, what would happen to your hand if you placed it on a hot stove and you could not feel pain? Well, again, you just burn your hand right through, down to the bone. When you place your hand on a hot stove, are you making a choice? I have my aggravations sometimes with my children, and there's the old saying that I grew up hearing sometimes, and I've heard it a lot since I had children from folks back home, that you're paying for your raising. But I remember one time as a child, I came into the laundry room, and the ironing board is set up, and I hear Mama say, "Don't touch that iron, it's hot." Well, the burned hand teaches best, as Gandalf would say. And so I had to go and touch it. Well, I made a choice, and there were consequences to that choice. I burned my finger. But I could have, it could have been a lot worse had I not been able to feel that pain. Would your free will be removed if you were forced to keep your hand away from a hot stove? Well, obviously, if I want to see if that thing really is hot, and I can't, there's some kind of a barrier, and I can't even touch it. But, I don't have that free will. It's something that we do by choice. But that pain is not an inherently bad thing. Sometimes the atheists, the agnostics, and so on, they'll talk about pain and suffering. In fact, sometimes they use three terms together: evil, pain, and suffering. But pain and suffering are not intrinsically evil. Really, nor are they intrinsically righteous or good. They just are what they are. It's pain and suffering. And spoiler alert, I'll go ahead and mention this. The reason there is any pain or suffering at all in this world goes back to what? The entrance of sin into this world in Genesis chapter 3. And I've said it numerous times. I've remember several times as a child sitting around thinking to myself, why did Adam and Eve go and mess it up for all of us? But if it hadn't have been Adam and Eve, it'd have been us. It'd have been me. It'd have been you. Because all have sinned. Only one human walked this earth and never committed a single sin. That's Jesus Christ. Let's go ahead and, as I said, I won't get through this section. Is the law of gravity constant and dependable? It is, isn't it? Look, if you fall out of a tree, if you're in a tree, or maybe you're hanging from a tree, it's been a long time since I hung from a tree, but if you're hanging there and holding on to that limb and you let go, all day, every time, you know what's going to happen? You will fall. That's just gravity. But it's constant, it's dependable. And again, those laws of nature argue for the existence of God, because there are things that we know how they're going to operate, and it's how we can do certain mathematical calculations, and we can send a rocket into space, even to the moon, and land it right there at a certain spot, because those laws are consistent, constant, dependable. What would happen if the law of gravity were random? Well, I submit to you that would argue as much, more so, for the non-existence of God. If everything's just in a constant state of chaos, random, then how do you know what's going to happen in any situation? What happens if you choose to test the law of gravity by jumping off a cliff? Well, I think we know the answer to that. You're going down. If you decide to test the law of gravity and suffer from a fall, who is to blame? Well, I guess the key there is if you decide, if you're pushed, that it might be somebody else to blame. But if you decide to test the law of gravity and you suffer a fall, well, I can't say that's anybody else's fault. Sometimes, in fact, that's one of the things we'll get into next week, and we unpack this a little bit further, is, the reasons. Why do people suffer? And that's sometimes what people want to know in the realm of this discussion. Well, okay, if there's a God, why do people suffer? We'll talk about that. But one of the reasons is sometimes is because of the choices we make. Again, there were times in my childhood when I made a decision to do something I knew I was not supposed to do, and I suffered for it. And sometimes, ironically, I would get angry at, guess who? Mom and Dad. Mean old parents. When in reality, it was my choice that brought about that suffering, that punishment. Now, not all punishment, or not all suffering is a punishment from God. And again, we'll talk about that some more next week, because that's what Job's friends thought, and they were wrong. If you benefit from the law of gravity, who should you praise? Again, the lawgiver. There are times when we benefit from natural laws. Sometimes we talk about, somebody fell down, but there are times when, something gets tossed up, and you don't want to just lose that thing. You don't want to just go flying off into outer space. It's going to come back down. We know that. So there are times when you might actually benefit from the law of gravity. Of course, James 1, 2, and 3, where he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." And so evil, pain, suffering, and again, I don't like even using those three terms together, because pain and suffering, there's nothing intrinsically evil about them. This is one of the big questions that comes up in this discussion, and I want to talk at length. Have we had one bell yet? Okay, so we'll save that for next week. I want to talk at length, at least a little bit more about Job. Job's suffering, because Job didn't suffer because he was a bad person. It's quite the opposite. Job suffered because he was righteous. But people want to know, why is it? In fact, a lot of Christians struggle with this. Papa, do you remember? I'm sorry, Brother Campbell. Do you remember? Everybody knows you better as Papa. Do you remember I think there were 3 things you gave us at camp a year or 2 ago in a lesson. Expectations that people have that God never promised. 3 things God never promised anybody. Do you remember those? I know that's putting you on the spot. One of them was a certain number of years on earth, maybe. Health, yeah. We were talking about this in one of our adult classes at Camp McCroy a couple of years ago, and Papa made the observation that there are 3 things that sometimes we expect from God as if He has promised them to us, but He hasn't. A certain number of years on this earth, that all of our relationships, as long as we're willing, will be good and go well, and physical health. You find a scripture that would apply to us today that says God's going to grant you so many number of years, that all your relationships are going to go well, and that you will have physical health all your time here on this earth. But yet sometimes we get frustrated and shake our fist at God. Why are you doing this? Why are you letting this happen? But what He has promised is, you follow me faithfully to the end, and you'll receive that crown of life, a home in heaven where there is no more suffering, there is no more having to deal with the challenge of a difficult relationship or something like that, no health difficulties, and life that is never ending. He hasn't promised us everything will be perfect here, but He's promised us it'll be perfect in the hereafter if we serve Him faithfully. But we'll talk more about why people suffer, and then we'll move on into this next section, which you can see if you have your booklet, which deals with punishment. And that's sometimes an argument that people have that maybe are questioning God's existence or don't believe in God. Well, how could I believe in God, or a God, they say, that would send someone to eternal punishment? We'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week. Thank y'all very much.